Thank you for that, Zan. That's grand. To start off with, we are going to go back to history. So Peter Manson has been volunteered to present on some of the historic events. Now, quite clearly, this isn't all of the historic flood events that have impacted us. There's 300 metres of sediment that makes the Heretaunga Plains at Awatoto, so I think it's more than one flood. But these are the ones where research was tied around them. And so Peter he was a lifer at Regional Council Land Management Group in Wairoa until he escaped and joined Ag First a little while ago. He experienced Cyclone Bowler and Cyclone Gabrielle very personally. So he's got sort of some deeply felt knowledge about it, and he's presenting some work that Alex Dixon pulled together as part of her thesis.
Kia ora koutou, ko Peter Manson toko inyo. My history is following leaving Canterbury a long time ago, in 1985, I went straight to Wairoa and lived there for 40 years, then moved to Hawke's Bay last year. I think that adds up. Just noting that I found it quite echoey over there. Is this clear enough, or do we need to adjust anything? It's okay, thanks. Before I start, just thinking about some of those points that Dan made. We chose to leave, my wife and I chose to leave a 140-year-old house in Wairoa after the cyclone that was flooded, and that would relate, many of you will be able to relate to that. But it was pretty clear to me that things have changed. Despite the fact we had bought this place on a silty soil type, which was pretty clearly created by floods, as Dan mentioned, and it was only a couple of 100 years old. So, some of the decisions we have to make are pretty clear. If there's no physical protection, that reduces the risk. And I think we might be looking at more of that in Hawke's Bay, but we won't be touching on that, or I certainly won't be. Right, I need to figure this out. Thank you. So as Dan mentioned, this is based on work that was done by Alex Dixon and Dan. Alex did her Masters in Environmental Science, and I believe Landwise fully funded this, which is interesting because previous work of this nature was government funded directly and led. So congratulations, Dan, for supporting this. So Dan and Alex decided early on that they would contribute to the community by following up and just seeing what they could do to help out. And particularly because Hawke's Bay is one of the most productive regions in the country. Clearly, the land is very productive down on the plains. It was produced by flooding, as Zan mentioned, over a very long time, and the flood impacts have been very significant over that time. So that's how our plains were built. And might need a drink of water actually. Do you mind, Dan? Might need a drink of water if it's okay. So three mountain ranges have created sediment that have built up these plains. So Ngaruroro ranges was probably more to the Esk Valley, but Ruahine and Kaweka ranges, which if you've been up there in your lifetime, will know that they do contribute an awful lot of sediment down the waterways. But the value of this land is considerable. Classes 1 to 3 are the top end. They are in highly productive land. Thanks, mate. Cheers. And if you've been involved with the highly productive land legislation, you'll know just how important that is. 14,500 hectares of fruit and vegetables are grown on the Heretaunga Plains. So for those of you who are not quite familiar with land use capability, all land in New Zealand is classified between 1 and 8, and 1 being the very highest productive land, and invariably is on silt country, and that's why it's so good. And then Class 8 may be, it's definitely economically unusable, and could be either mountainous land, which is the most common type of Class 8, or it could be even coastal sand dunes that are blowing away. Class 1 to 3 are producing enormous amounts of food for the population and for export. 90% of our plains are Class 1 to 3, and only, as you can see, only 14% of the total of New Zealand's area is within those 3 classes. So it's vitally important that we do all we can to protect and to rehabilitate that land after an event. The whole of Hawke's Bay's region, out of that whole region area, only about 13% of the total area is highly productive land. It's extremely valuable. Right, so let's talk about past events. I see the time here, Dan, you better let me know how that looks. So there's quite a recurring pattern, as Zan has mentioned. We'll examine each event in detail, but Gabrielle will be covered by others today, so we'll just talk about the 4 that led up to that. And significantly, the Esk Valley flood, 1938, Gisborne flood, Cyclone Bowler, and the Southern North Island flood. Floods are the ones that provided data, or were investigated to provide data that will help us to recover land after Cyclone Gabrielle. So the work that's been done by Alex and Dan validated that, but they've added to it as well. There were obviously many events prior to these 4. And, of course, while we're talking about floods, the 1931 earthquake was very significant because of what it did to the land and how it changed the drainage patterns. For instance, we have the Ngaruroro River, which used to flow, used to flow to the south between Napier and Hastings. Don't ask me, I don't remember that. And then it moved to that northern route where it currently sits. So just imagine if that happened today. I think we would find some considerably larger impacts than what we did see in Cyclone Gabrielle. What happened after that was some legislation was passed, the 1868 Marlborough and Hawke's Bay Rivers Act. Unfortunately, it had some unintended consequences. And I think we all know that every government legislation has unintended consequences, but that was serious because people were building their own stop banks and diverting water onto each other's land. That did not work. And that evolved. So we had, as you can see, there's a list there of how the legislation evolved and became a whole lot better. So it became amalgamated, and then we were able to have one big board in Hawke's Bay that was able to manage flood risk and erosion risk. So those early days were chaotic, and then that evolved, as I said. They built stop banks, not terribly efficiently, but it did work. And interestingly, introduced willows to control water within those stop banks, but didn't know how to manage them, so that became a disaster in itself. And they've learnt to manage those within waterways. But willows, I might add, are still a very important part of waterway management within the stop banks. And on we went in the hill country, developing land, removing scrub, removing forest, and just accepting that this was going to be something we had to live with. Then we moved to the earthquake, and if you look at that left-hand image, you'll see, if you were a boatie, you would have been terribly disappointed. That was a beautiful sailing area, I believe, that Ngaruroro Lagoon, and within minutes it disappeared. And the land was uplifted 1 to 2 metres, 1.5 metres, and the whole lot drained. We found another 1,300 hectares of really good land. And the Esk River changed course within the valley, but obviously it didn't affect the major part of the plains. The Tūtaekurī River used to flow into that lagoon, and obviously with 1.5 metres of elevation, it changed its mind. It went somewhere else to its present course. And then there was more legislation to help with the erosion impacts. Enormous amounts of rain in the Esk Valley disaster in 1938. That was, sorry, I skipped ahead with the legislation. So it had enormous amount of rainfall. There was a lot of shallow slips and an enormous amount of damage. A flood relief committee was established soon after the extent of the damage was known, and the first priority was to clear re-soak areas before the silt became too dry. So focusing on that lower land, which has always been the focus. And what they discovered was sowing as soon as possible on that sediment was the right thing to do, but as long as you could walk on it, because it was mostly done by hand. And back in those days, of course, we just did not have the technology and the machinery that was capable of that very large scale, quick response that we do now. And following that was a dust storm. And I think we have heard about the potential for the same thing this last time around with Cyclone Gabrielle. However, because of that ability to respond quickly, better information, and certainly better engagement from agencies, that most of the ground had been sown down. We did see some dust this time, but nothing like back then. It was enormously damaging from all accounts. And in terms of, I believe, even human health. So the 1938 crisis was a turning point for New Zealand's approach to land and water management. We had another Act of Parliament passed, and there was a vision to try and reduce the amount of impact on steep erosion land. The idea was to construct better flood control schemes, to regenerate native forests, and afforestation programs were put in place. And there was a true turning point. And one of our leaders in the industry, Lance McCaskill, gave us that quote, which is right there, a landmark event which led to subsequent decades of soil conservation efforts. And that is quite true. However, you might argue that we haven't done enough. And I'm sure there are those who would, despite those of us who've been working really hard at it over those decades, it's a long way to go. Then the Gisborne flood, 1948, which was the same one that blew away the Wairau Bridge. I wasn't there for that either, but it was particularly damaging in Gisborne. And that was only 10 years after the Esk Valley disaster. The Waipoua River burst its banks and flowed through a large part of the Gisborne Plains. We've had several floods in Gisborne since then, including Cyclone Bowler, which we'll touch on. There were enormous losses of £165,000, which is roughly $15 million in today's terms. And that prompted the another lot, and particularly intensive research on revegetating silt. Then Cyclone Bowler came soon after that. 40 years after that, almost exactly 40 years. So I'll go back. The light sandy silt was discovered to be difficult to revegetate. Medium silt dries quickly, but once you wait long enough to get onto it, was probably easy to revegetate. But the key point was that timing was critical. Cyclone Bowler, I do remember that one. We were directly affected in Wairoa, and Hawke's Bay was as well, of course, and Esk Valley was hit pretty hard. Huge losses, and I know, Zan, you mentioned that this last payout was probably one of the last that government said they will be paying. However, I'd also recall in Cyclone Bowler, when they paid $100,000 to each farmer, they said this was the last time they would pay out. We've had a number since then. And by the way, Cyclone Bowler, while people got their fences fixed and their access sorted, they also bought their first quad bike. And that was a notable improvement, and horses started to disappear, thank God, from the landscape. Because in the regional council days, catchment board days, we were plonked on horses when we went out there, and for those of us who are not riders, it was not a great idea. So key findings, again, timing is everything. Too early or too late was difficult to get pastures established. Although it was found that white clover and perennial ryegrass was suitable, it still is the case that the moata or annual ryegrass is by far the quickest and easiest to get started, even without fertiliser. However, obviously fertiliser is preferable, and particularly nitrogen, because the sediment is so low in nitrogen. Surface water needs to be drained away, and so that you're not working in mud and birds can't feed easily. But the surface has to be moist and sticky, so it's a bit of a fine line. And what I might just add, which is a bit of an add-on to this, I'm afraid, is that there's a human element here. People are still under stress, and I guess this might come up. But decision-making, this is all very well if you're making good decisions. But a lot of people I discovered were not making good decisions, were not ready to make a decision. So the facts are great, but I think that human element, that link between the advisor and the technical facts are vitally important. There's a simple graph which just shows, in brief, that the shallower the soil, the less benefit there is from cultivation, because you've already got the access to that original soil. And there's a lovely flow chart, which you needn't even look at, just to know that there is one, which tells you, works your way through all those different scenarios. I'm sure there's access to that. And it's a framework that was put together prior to Cyclone Gabrielle, but was refined by Dan and team. So European settlement has created a lot of issues. Not only have we put crops in places that are at risk, we have created stop banks that have a threshold, and we have cleared the land, which is putting even bigger pressure on our infrastructure. There's no doubt that the cycle has not finished. This is not the last cyclone we will see. It could even be that those intervals are decreasing in time. So things that keep coming up are that timing is critical, Moving on down there, species selection's critical, and there are different ways of approaching it depending on the sediment type. It's a pretty common view that many of us have seen and experienced. So Gabrielle exceeded historical benchmarks, but it's not necessarily the largest and the last that we will see. It fits the pattern. What it teaches us is that land can be recovered. It's not that complex, but decision making is vital. And protecting upland vegetation is critical too. And my own personal belief is we need to find better ways of getting this accelerated. So 5 key messages. Flooding is not an aberration. It's part of the life we live and where we live. It's been going on for 250,000 years, and it's not going to stop tomorrow. So the major events will recur, and possibly more frequently. Thirdly, we've intensified the problem through the way we've treated the land, both upland and on the flats. Fourthly, we have excellent knowledge and from the research that we've done on how to respond. And fifthly, building a future resilience is something we need to focus on. Clearly, we have intensified the land. There we go. So I will move on. That's all of my message.